already. Hello, everyone. I hope you're able to join us today for what we hope is going to be quite a lively and interesting discussion. Welcome to the Frontline Freelance Register. We are a charitable, well, we actually were set up by the Frontline Club's charitable trust, and we are set up by freelancers for freelancers to advocate for the safety and the welfare of journalists who are exposed to risk. But that's not just journalists, that's filmmakers, that's travel writers, that's adventurers, explorers, who are not only exposed to risk in hostile conflict zones, but also in remote and challenging areas. So it's quite a wide range of disciplines, and we have a wide range of members. We have over 960 members. Today, we are having a discussion about diversity in the frontline freelance arena. So it's diversity in frontline freelance journalism. And we have a great range of panelists today who are here with us. Obviously, it's an issue that's been going on for a long time. There's a huge growing discontent amongst what's been somewhat controversially called BaME filmmakers and journalists about the lack of diversity in the media. And we're talking obviously both in broadcast and in journalism and in publishing news and current affairs. So this issue has been talked about for a very long time, but what we're looking at now is this really about to start changing for the good? So today we've got a great range of panelists, from journalists, documentary filmmakers, photojournalists, travel writers and adventurers, to discuss their experiences of how more diverse filmmakers and how more diverse voices can enrich our understanding of complex places and issues. And we're also hoping today to raise awareness and discuss what we can all do to address the imbalance in our own work and encourage commissioners, editors and others to do the same. So our speakers today is Ash Bhardwaj. Ash is a travel writer, filmmaker, podcaster and broadcaster who likes to tell unfamiliar stories about familiar places. Ash has a column in Telegraph Travel. He writes for The Times Travel, he writes for GQ and many other outlets. Ash also reports for BBC Radio 4 and the World Service, and has filmed on all of Levison Wood's TV series, which has been exploring some pretty amazing places around the world. He's also made current affairs films for ITV and Channel 4. And in 2018, Ash travelled 8,500 kilometres from the Arctic to the Crimea. Not quite sure why, mainly to explore, I believe, the legacy of the USSR. So Ash has also recently wrote an influential article about the importance of ethnic and social diversity in travel storytelling for the Telegraph, which has kind of been the impetus and the springboard for today's discussion. So hi there, Ash.
Hello, how are you? Thank you very much.
Hi there, hi.
Long and hyphenated introduction, Sharon. Thank you.
Somewhat long introduction, but we want to sort of get everyone to understand who we've got on the panel today. And next up, we've got Nyasha Kandara. Nyasha is a Zimbabwean documentary filmmaker and journalist, and she works on a variety of issues that affect various parts of Africa for a variety of international broadcasters in the UK, Europe, and the US. Nyasha is currently based in Nairobi in Kenya, and she joins us there today. She's also got a master's degree in journalism and documentary filmmaking from Columbia Journalism School. Recently, of interest, she's directed the feature broadcast documentary Imported for My Body, which was a year-long investigation that uncovered an illegal network that trafficked, which found that African women were being trafficked into India. And that was for BBC Africa Eye. She also serves as the secretary of the Foreign Correspondents Association of East Africa. So welcome, Nyasha.
Thank you for having me.
You're really welcome. Great to see you. And also next we have Safa Al-Ahmad, who is a Saudi Arabian journalist based in the US and the UK. Is that right, Safa? And you're coming to us from Brooklyn today.
Neither, but okay.
What's that?
Neither, but okay.
No, well, you live in London, but currently you're in Brooklyn. Saf is a double Emmy Award-winning documentary filmmaker, and she has directed a number of documentaries for PBS and BBC, most notably Saudi's Secret Uprising, which exposed the hidden revolt on the streets of Saudi Arabia amongst the ruling class, which was a few years ago now, but that was a particularly interesting documentary because it actually revealed a story that most of us wouldn't have been even aware was happening if it wasn't for Safa's reporting. Safa has also reported on Yemen for a decade and has traveled to some quite hairy places in the world, particularly in Yemen and amongst Al-Qaeda and Houthi-controlled territory. That was for your latest PBS, is that right, Safa, which was Yemen Under Siege?
No, PBS loves putting Yemen in every title. The latest one is Targeting Yemen, which is about American counterterrorism in Yemen.
That's the one. And which one was just nominated for an Emmy?
That one.
That one, excellent. Yeah. So also congratulations for that, to be nominated. And we also are hoping to connect with Pierre Alozzi. Pierre is a photojournalist of many years experience around the globe, but Pierre is currently in a log cabin in Switzerland. So hopefully with the internet, he'll be able to join us at a later stage. Oh, Pierre is here. Are you there, Pierre? Can you hear us, Pierre? I can't hear you, Pierre. Okay, we'll move on. I think, and Sarah Giazeri, who is the director of the Frontline Freelance Register, Sarah is also lurking quietly in the background, who's monitoring social media for us and who's helping out with technical issues. Hopefully she'll be able to connect with Pierre as well, and is also the director of the Frontline Freelance Register, who single-handedly basically advocates for the safety and the welfare of freelance journalists around the world. So let's get into it. Let's start. What we're going to do now is we're going to basically have 10 minutes with each panelist. And then after that, we'll all have an open discussion for about 10 minutes. We'll try and stick to an hour, just so that everyone can keep focus. And obviously it's really hot today, so it would be good if we can keep things to time. And so we'll have a discussion after that. And we're also hoping to have time for Q&A after, so that everyone can have, if they've got any questions from the panelists themselves or about the wider issues in general. So Ash, if we can start with you. I mean, obviously you've worked in a lot of different places around the world, and you're a British, half Indian, half British filmmaker, journalist and travel writer. What compelled you to write the Telegraph article which you recently wrote?
I think it started when I was first starting to travel to interesting places, particularly to India, which of course is the place of my father's heritage. Finding it very hard to find material that was written that was relevant to me. Most of the books that I was reading about India were written by white men who have a very specific experience. Obviously I have the male experience. The experience of traveling around India as a white man is quite different to a brown man traveling around India. And I realized, of course, that's applicable to a lot of different things. So that lack of being able to access a relevant experience to me through literature from British Indian people was replicated for friends of mine who I spoke to of other diversities of both ethnicity and social background. And because most travel writing was done by privileged white men, that was the only perspective you got on travel. Sometimes this was, it meant that things occurred in places that you wouldn't have known about. So Manisha Rajesh, who's a friend of mine who wrote a book called Around the World in 80 Trains, wrote about her experience of being spat on at a Russian train station. And she'd never read about that before because the only books she'd read about Russia were by white men who don't get spat at in Russia. Brown women do. So some of it is you're unaware of negative experiences. And the other thing is you don't read about positive experiences so much. So if I travel to a place like Nepal, the villagers up in the Himalayas are more likely to come up and speak to me because they're curious why the person who looks a little bit like them is hanging around with a bunch of Americans and Germans and Brits traveling around Nepal. So it gives you like a bit of an in. When I was traveling around New Zealand, like the young Maori guide who was showing us down the Wanganui River was happy to talk to me about his heritage and culture because he knew what it was like to come from a country that had been commodified and had its culture exploited by British imperialism. He understood that. I would probably empathise a bit with that as someone who's half Indian. So it does create a bit of a link, creates a bridge. But if you only get one perspective of travel narrative, then you miss out on entire ideas. That's important for one aspect when it comes to going on holiday to places, which is what a lot of travel writing in the papers or magazines is about. But hearing about Nyasha and Safa's stories about the kind of documentaries that they've made, there's a vital component of if we ignore the stories and interests of people of different diverse backgrounds, we lose vital information. So, you know, why the implication of what happened in Saudi Arabia a few years ago with that uprising is vital to our security, particularly for a nation that likes to get involved in Middle Eastern politics. The idea that African women are being trafficked into India is like, I don't understand what's going on there. Why is that happening? So having people who want to tell those stories is vital for our wider understanding of the world. So I think this isn't just a case of we need to improve diversity because people should be given opportunities. That's a very valid reason to improve diversity within filmmaking and travel writing. The other side is, for those of us that are curious about the world from either a joyous perspective of wanting to travel and learn new things, and those of us who work in current affairs or foreign policy, we need to know these stories, otherwise we're going to constantly be making mistakes. And I see this happening in Britain all the time. Just the other day I was talking to someone who said, you know, Britain and India, we've got this great bond, this great connection through the Raj. I was like, you do realise that India views that as 200 years of looting and exploitation. So you might think of that positively, but India views that very negatively. And if you go to India with that perspective, like a certain prime minister does, then you will just end up damaging prospectus for trade deals or international relations. So you need to have that knowledge. And if the perspective is only coming from people who are not necessarily doing it mendaciously, like this guy who talks about the legacy of the Raj, then you will just keep making mistakes. So that's why it's important from an almost reductionist perspective.
And it seems, it's almost like a no-brainer, isn't it? I mean, if you're only going to get a view of one person's experience, which, let's face it, mainly in British broadcasting, for example, we're seeing a white Western, usually, dare I say, pale, male and stale, where we are getting a very specific and quite narrow perspective on a country. How frustrated are you when you try to get all your pitching stuff and stories, not just to broadcasters, but to travel writers, where maybe editors just don't get it?
So I've been pretty lucky in my travel writing experience, which is different to my trying to get stuff commissioned. People are surprised when I say this, but I would say that I write for The Telegraph, whose political and political commentary and opinion doesn't match my general views of the world generally. But within the travel section, the first person to commission me for a piece of travel writing was a guy called Mike Kerr, and he commissioned me to write a piece about taking my dad's ashes to India. So, you know, that's pretty cool that he was like, this is interesting, and this is a story that needs to be told. Mike's Irish, his background's Irish. The guy that commissioned me now, Ben Ross, always says, you know, you bring an interesting insight into things, and you actually reveal things and talk about subjects that some of our other writers are just unaware of. And that makes what we put out better. So that's a really good form of commissioning. The reason that article ended up being written about was I tweeted about it. And one of the editors of The Telegraph contacted me directly and said, this is a really important subject. We've not done enough good on this. I'll give you a call later so we can start discussing how we can improve it. That is a model way of dealing with what could be a PR nightmare. And they've gone, right, we've recognised a problem. We recognise we've not done enough. Now here's a solution for how we're going to improve it. And then not only did they commission that first piece, but they've taken the initiative even further, and now commission me to write regular pieces for them. What I've often found within television is a real lack of courage to make difficult decisions. It's such a cliche that a lot of television is not driven by creativity, but by about a fear of losing audience numbers. And if something has worked before, then they'll just keep redoing iterations of that. Now, my major frustration on adventure travel in the UK is that they only seem to commission bearded white ex-military men to do adventure. I'd say this is a bearded man who's in the Army Reserve, so I'm probably best person to be advocating for change. But there are, why are there not more stories by women doing adventure? Why are there not more stories of women of colour doing adventure? Because I can assure you that, for India being a place of really deep colorism, if you're a black person travelling around India, that will be a very different experience from an Indian woman travelling around India. So having all these different experiences are vital, because you learn insights in a place, and you also just reveal much more interesting things, because I'm really bored of those TV shows with just like ex-military blokes going, here I am in this place, great, doing something tough. Let's find something a bit more interesting. And what I touched on with about my experiences in Nepal or when I go to New Zealand, you just get a completely different, you just get received in a very different way. And I think for the audience that's interesting, because they can learn new things as well.
Absolutely, and it's also quite, I know from a lot of filmmakers and journalists that I speak to, is the lack of diversity amongst commissioning editors themselves and editors and publishers. Do you find that an issue? Because still we have a lot of commissioning editors who are white and Western, mainly male, although there are still quite a lot of female commissioning editors. Do you also think that, there is this real fear of being risk averse, like you were just saying, because ratings matter, and if something has rated really well in the past, let's just do more of the same, only slightly different, so that it becomes very lazy and unoriginal.
Yeah, and I think it's not necessarily based on, it's the different notions of what people understand as racism to be. There's the outward racism of deliberately stopping people of diversity or classism, of people of different social backgrounds from doing things, because they're sort of like, we don't want those people on our channel. I don't think that happens very much. But what you tend to get instead is, that doesn't work, it just doesn't resonate with the audience, so let's just do what we've done. The fact that you've seen a remarkable creative put out, was it I Will Destroy You, I May Destroy You. That shows if you have courage in doing a different type of storytelling from a black woman from a comparatively deprived social background, that can create one of the best breakout pieces of television in years. So the successes of things like that should shake up commissioners to do stuff. Like I said, I don't think they're necessarily doing it out of mendacious, sitting around as this cabal of stopping people of colour getting on TV. They just don't have the bravery or courage or the creativity to commission those sorts of things. And they just keep commissioning.
Absolutely.
So that happens because it can hopefully shatter that narrowing of perspective that exists within them.
And do you find, just lastly, that not only you in front of the camera, there's a lack of diversity, but also behind the camera in terms of directors and producers? Are you finding that you're mainly working with white Westerners, or are you trying to actively engage with other diverse filmmakers? And how do you feel about the BaME label as well?
Well, I think it's also, one should also recognise one's own prejudices, in the sense of, if you see that the successful people out there are these producers and these producers, and they all look, or these directors, and they all look the same, it's very hard to stop yourself feeding into that belief that those are the people that are more successful. And often there's a sort of a bullish confidence that comes with them, partly because of educational backgrounds rather than an inherent competence. I think it's a really good idea where you can to commission, work with, not commission, but to work with and develop ideas with people of diverse backgrounds, of ethnicity and class and gender, because you will get more creativity. Otherwise, you will just get more of what's come before. And TV.
And also, it's important to give opportunities, because there's some people will say, oh, we can't hire that person because they've got a lack of experience. But as Nyasha will talk about as well, is that how do you get the experience if you don't get the opportunity?
There's a massive issue. Well, and
it's a catch-22.
And as for the BaME label, the experience of a second-generation East African Indian is very different from a first-generation Somali. So, the BaME label is pretty useless. My experience as someone of fairly ambiguous ethnic background who's fairly well spoken, is pretty different to like a first generation Somali kid from Hackney. So that's why the BaME label isn't particularly useful. I think.
Indeed. Exactly. I mean, it's a very strange generic term, and obviously there's also a lot of tokenism, which actually, if we bring you into the conversation now. So Nyasha, you've obviously worked for a lot of different channels internationally, and you are African yourself, you're Zimbabwean. How do you feel about trying to get your own stories on camera and trying to get your own commissions? How do you find it when you pitch stories to international broadcasters?
I mean, there are many challenges, I think, that come with trying to tell stories that either haven't been pitched before or trying to pitch stories in a nuanced manner. I think because of what's already out there in terms of the content, people always look at us in a very myopic way. When you present them with a story with layered characters, it's either not sensational enough for them, or they say, well, this couldn't possibly be the real how people are, or like they couldn't possibly enjoy this type of music because our stories are like corruption and poverty. So no one believes that like they're beautiful weddings that happen in a refugee camp, because they just don't think that people have time to fall in love. And that's what happens when you don't give us nuance or the time and the perspective to actually tell those stories. I think that's one of the challenges that I find. And another one is that when it comes to telling stories from our own backyard, is sometimes you get accused of being too close to the story, which I always find very funny, because I say, well, did anyone ask anyone at the BBC or Channel 4 if they were too close to the story of Brexit? Or is anyone watching at the Washington Post too close to the stories that are happening in the White House? But when we tell stories from our backgrounds, apparently we can't distinguish or we can't be objective about certain stories, which is very condescending and is also very frustrating when you're trying to get a pitch across to a commissioning editor, or you're in the process of editing a story you've been working on for a really long time and trying to make sure you do all of these nuances. And I think as a person from Zimbabwe and Africa, and you also feel a deep sense of responsibility because of the reporting that's already out there, to represent people really well. So you're carrying this burden and the weight of incorrect reporting or a lack of nuance, trying to put that all in and tell your stories and get that pitch across, which also is a lot of work, which I don't necessarily think that people who come from overseas, when they fly in, they don't owe anyone anything. They don't have to carry that with them. And they also usually are going to go back to where they come from. They're not going to like meet somebody in the supermarket and be like, are you that girl who did this story? You know, and then have a conversation with somebody from that community that you've reported, who will either say, we don't like the way we represent you, or this is completely false, or where did that perspective come from? So I think our experience, especially living on the continent, it's very different.
And tell me about your specific experience when you're actually pitching stories to international broadcasters who may, for example, be trying to tell you that something's not happening when they haven't been to that country, or they're trying to editorialize their own spin on a certain issue.
Yeah, I think I've had experience with that. I did a year-long investigation looking into sex trafficking of African women by Africans to India. And this was basically an unreported story. When I first looked into it, there were only 2 articles online I had seen. When I talked to people about it, when I talked to Western journalists who were based as correspondents in New Delhi, they were all like, well, that's not a thing. You know, and when I talked to the commissioning editors, they're like, well, we haven't seen that, we haven't heard of that. And I was like, do you think it's possible that there was no way you could have heard of it because you're so far from the story? I actually knew someone, unfortunately, who was trafficked. And I can tell you from what I'm hearing on the phone, she is not making this up. There are numbers to this. There are people who've been coming, who've been being trafficked for years. Like, I have all of this evidence, and it was, you know, just to get the work to be able to go to India to see for myself, knowing in my gut feeling, you really have to believe in your story and keep pushing. That's one of the things I found, to really be like, this is a story, this is important, it's in the public interest, and it has to be told. And that can be quite a challenging process.
And how frustrated do you feel when quite often you see white Western filmmakers like myself going to places like Africa and making stories and then hooking up with a local producer, which we end up calling fixers, to get the contacts and to get the research on the ground. How do you feel about that? And why aren't you telling those stories? Why don't you get the opportunity?
I mean, I could talk about this forever, because it frustrates me to no end the definition of what producers do, logistics, setting up interviews. If you find the character, you're the producer, local or not. I don't even know sometimes why they even put the term local. You've produced the story. If I couldn't get you access to this, there was no story. Therefore, why am I being called a fixer? Why am I being paid a lower rate? Why am I not getting the credit? And then when it comes to us being able to pitch stories and move up in the industry, if you are constantly being labeled as a fixer, you're never going to be able to become a director one day, or be a senior producer or an executive producer or a commissioning editor, because you keep getting these same titles, when we all know that if you pitched up in Nairobi today, you wouldn't even know where to start.
Exactly, and that's really got to change. And how do you feel about these, diversity tokenism, all these diversity initiatives that a lot of channels have, like Channel 4 and the BBC and various other channels around the world who've got diversity initiatives, but quite often, do you feel like it's some people say it's a tick boxing exercise where they get the runner who's BaME? That's not really going to help the advancement of.
People don't understand what the purpose of diversity is and what we're actually looking for. I think for me, I always use the word equity. Is like, it's not just about getting a seat at the table, it's about getting voting rights. So if you're in a diversity organization, and what you find is organizations, they go firstly hire a diversity consultant, which I think is a waste of money. So you already hire someone to tell you what has already been told in 1,001 pieces and webinars like these. So you go hire this person, and they take 2 years to then come up with a report about how you should then change your company. So you've already lost time in that, which is what you find organizations do. And then when it comes to this window dressing, which we all know is apparent, is they say, well, we've just hired a whole bunch of, interns of people of color. And I'm like, what is an intern going to do? I mean, yes, I was an intern once and you start there, but this intern has no decision-making power. They're not a commissioning editor. They do not offer editorial policies that can determine the nuance of stories, the direction, what is actually newsworthy. And they're not executive producers, so they're not mentoring. They have no power. And it's also frustrating to be in an organization where you finally get in and you're hired and you're reported, and you realize, oh, I'm the only Black person in the room. And I'm the only person in the room, and I'm very open-minded in the sense that I like working with all sorts of people of color, just because there's diversity and you have different perspectives and you can all contribute to each other. But sometimes you walk into a space and you're 1 out of 20. What am I supposed to do with that? There's nothing. And at the same time, I pitch a story, but then there's this trickle-down effect where all of these influences come, that by the time the story comes out, is it even my story? Is it even from my perspective? Because you have all of these opinions who come from a very specific background, who have no idea, maybe not even have left their country to come to this country where you're reporting from. And then there's no influence. And sometimes you look at your stories and you think, did I do that? And that's quite disheartening, I think, when people get those opportunities into organizations. So for me, I always say to people, what we need is equity. What I want to see in all of the newsrooms is like, I want to see execs of color. I want to see editors of color. I think I've only ever spoken in the last 5 years of working to one commissioning editor of color. In my entire 5 years, and it's not like diversity is a new topic. We've been talking about this for eons.
I mean, it doesn't take much, you'd think, would it, it's like, what do you need to do? Well, it's quite simple. Hire people of color in top roles, in commissioning, in execs, at the top echelons of filmmaking, directors and producers and reporters. It's quite simple, really, isn't it? It's like, why do you need another diversity initiative, or why do you need another report to tell everyone what's already been said many, many times over? And I can totally understand your complete frustration with that. And also, you were just talking about editorializing from a specific viewpoint, which is obviously, if you've got a white Western exec, they are going to come at it quite rightly, quite naturally, with their own preconceptions and their own prejudices. And also, do you feel also that that's sometimes quite middle class? Because, you know, we're talking about diversity, not just in color and gender. I mean, we haven't gone into the sort of gender side of things. We're going to concentrate on that on another panel. But also within socio-economic backgrounds, because there is a lack of diversity, particularly obviously here in the UK, with working class filmmakers who don't get to show the real story behind from what they've experienced.
Definitely. I think the media and the journalism industry is layered with privilege, and we all have to acknowledge that. I've spoken to people who are British, who technically would fit all the right boxes, who talk about the level of privilege within really established old organizations where people come from certain backgrounds. I know I can say this as a person who went to a very prestigious university to do my master's in journalism. There were 3 Africans in that program. It's the most expensive thing you could have, you can ever like attain. And I needed scholarship money to get to that. But I also realized because I have that, that now gives me access to certain things that a lot of other people don't. And what are we doing to bridge the gap from people who don't have access to these things that then give them privilege or status to tell stories? Because what ends up happening is we just have a bunch of people who all come from really fancy schools doing the storytelling, and you know, that's not good.
And do you think now, because there's been a gaining momentum, do you think now there is perhaps a real chance for change? Do you feel there are things maybe changing?
I mean, well, I think that it's still early to tell. I do think this is not the first time we're having the conversation, so I'm skeptical. And I think what I'm first seeing is there's a lot of quick window dressing, which I said is in the form of hiring people at the lower level without really thinking strategically. Like, you need to have these guys who have actual influence at different levels of the hierarchy. I'm still yet to see some of that. I also think that now there's a growing trend, and not necessarily call out culture, but a reckoning, especially within the documentary space, to say who is directing stories, who are the producers, how close are they to the story. And you're seeing that in different platforms of people writing op-eds to say, you know, this documentary doesn't have a single person of color on the team, but it's about Tiger Woods. How is that still happening in 2020? And then the filmmakers are actually being forced to respond and have that conversation now, which a few years ago, you didn't even get that accountability. You didn't even have a response. So at least now I think people are engaging more because they realize they can't hide under rocks anymore.
And I think it is up to all of us to help try and make change, because, for example, I worked on a major landmark BBC documentary a few years ago, which was ostensibly about a Black and minority ethnic issue. And I was pretty horrified to discover that actually the only Black person on the production team was a researcher. And I did actually mention it because I think it is up to all of us to actually say, hang on a minute, why is this going on? Hang on, why, when I look up in a room at a production company, all I see usually is white men, generally. I mean, there are still quite a few women around, but generally, sometimes when I look up at a production company, I do see just a lot of white men. And it is up to us to actually say, why is that? Why haven't you got a Black director making this film? Why haven't you got a Black exec on this film, for example? I mean, are there other ways that you think we should be changing? I mean, obviously, we can challenge it and question it. Do you think quotas help? Actually having a diversity quota that makes and enforces channels and broadcasters and production companies to have a specific number of BaME production crew?
I think that quotas can be helpful, but I also think that people know that this is, like, when people know that there's a quota, there's also like, what intention is behind it? Am I just going to have this role, or are you actually going to invest in me? I think one of the things I've talked about is that people say, oh, well, there's not enough people on the continent with like experience to tell stories. And I'm like, well, how about you pair them with people who do have the experience that builds their credit status, that then moves them? So the next time you hire someone who you find as a producer, you know, why don't you get them to a point where they can work with a senior producer so that the next time they can pitch the story, or they co-direct? Like, you basically have to lift like people up in that way of like building an ecosystem. And so you have to put resources into that. And those resources aren't just hiring people. Because if you just hire people and don't give them any support, any training, any mentorship, you're setting them up to fail. And then tomorrow, when they don't fail, say, well, you see that one time we hired this person, see what happened. But the system was rigged.
That is actually a very good point, because I've seen that happen quite a lot, where there's been a lack of mentoring and that person has almost been set up to fail. And of course, that is really crucial to have that support and that network of mentoring that, you know, helps give that person the skills and the experience to move forward and climb up the ladder, dare I say, into making films that, you know, they can be proud of. So Safa, thanks very much for that, Nyasha. So Safa, you've obviously been working a lot around the world, particularly in the Middle East, on your films, and you've been around for quite some time. How do you find it working with international broadcasters who are obviously quite Western? How do you go about pitching your work, and how do you find the response? And can you talk us through a little bit about that?
I mean, my God, I agree with everything Nyasha and Ash said and more. I mean, the white gaze is so toxic. It's so toxic to the extent that even, and I agree with the tokenism of all of this, because even when you get brown people to work in difficult and big projects, we still internalize the white gaze in a way. And I'll talk specifically about my experience as a freelancer, because not only are you working as a minority in this industry that systematically is set up, right, to stop you from being able to truly tell the stories the way you want to be telling them. And Nyasha's point is really important on that, and the responsibility that I feel, because we are not, our stories are not represented enough, right? And so the responsibility of me to do the one film, right, and not to fuck up on that one film, because if it does, then that's it. Oh, look, you know, she did so badly. So that's one thing. But we are internalizing as well as like, what kind of stories can I pitch that will get commissioned? Because I also need to work, right? And so you kind of internalize the white gaze, and it's like, okay, what will work? Like in the era of ISIS, everybody and their mother is pitching the story on ISIS in different angles, right? Because you know that's the story that will be picked up by them, because it reinforces and feeds the shit that they want to be seeing on our region, right? And I mean, the Middle East and Africa in that way, we are cursed in this interest, but also in this lack of interest of anything that is diverse, that does not feed the stereotypes they already have of us, right? And so I will disagree with something Ash said in that the importance of the West understanding us, right? Like, I'm not coming from the perspective the West needs to understand us. I'm coming from the perspective I am of the region, and I have the right to be as complex and as nuanced and as human as any other white person deserves to be in the West, right? And so I hate it when I'm pitching stuff and they're like, why should Americans care about this? Because you are the ones who are killing us. Maybe you should give a shit about the region, right? In a way that is not just beyond what is your interest, because this is the white gaze, right? This is the white gaze of like, everything has to relate to how the West needs to see us and that power dynamic between us, right? And I'm like, how do you break that power dynamic so then you can relate to me as a human, right? And so the story about like how we can have joy and beauty in our lives is something so foreign that no, we need to show us as dying victims, right? And this is the only space, and I am complicit in this, because I'm doing a project now where I'm doing a retrospective of my work, and I have to own my own privilege and how the white gaze in the work I've done, right? But it's just like, okay, so do I do nothing? Because it's not exactly how I would want to do it. Like the Saudi film is a great example of filming it was hard, but editing it in London was a lot harder. You're fighting over every word in your script, right? You are thinking not only of what works in this film, but what will people back home think of the word that I've used? Am I reinforcing stereotypes? When I say a minority Shia uprising and a Sunni government, is that really true? Technically it is, but it's not, right? There is nuance in class warfare and in the complexity of what's going on inside Saudi Arabia. The story was actually two different cities uprising, right? One was Sunni and one was Shia, but it was more complex than it just being Shia or Sunni. It's about power. It's about the dynamics of state. But I didn't have the time or space within a half-hour film to be able to discuss all of these things. But because I was the only one who was doing it, I felt the pressure of saying all of these things, which is impossible, right? But this is part of the racism of the structure, where you become the definitive story on X. What the fuck is that? How can you be a definitive story on anything on a country? Like it's demeaning, it's racist, it's oriental, like all of these things. And this is like the Saudi film took me a really long time to get commissioned because of all these things, right? And then we're telling me, it's like, oh, is that important? What about you do women can't drive in Saudi? The country's on fire and you want me to talk about a bunch of women? You see what I mean? Like the priority, because as a woman, I must be interested in not driving. And I to this day, I refuse to do that story. Because of that, because they want to pigeonhole me into, she's a woman, she must be interested in this thing, you know, where they can't drive when there are people being murdered in the streets for rising up, because that's not a narrative they want to hear on Saudi, right? They want to hear about that narrative, that backwards, you know, let's save the brown woman from the brown man, like let's talk about the savior complex, right? And that's really complex. But then for me, it becomes harder. It's like, okay, I have to be even more conscious of what do I pitch, my responsibility about the angle of the story I'm pitching, how I film it, how I write it and frame it afterwards, how it's presented when it airs, how it lives. Like the responsibilities that we have are a lot more. Like, you're right, Nyasha, when you're talking about the white guy when he shows up in a random country, he doesn't give a shit when he comes out, right? It doesn't really matter to him what happens after he leaves or the impact of that. It doesn't follow him around. Every film I make follows me for the rest of my life, right? I pay the price. It's not the BBC or PBS that pays the price for something that happens in the film. It's me, right? And that is fine. I will take that burden because that's part of my privilege of doing this work, right? But they don't understand that. They don't understand the death threats, the security issues that I have to carry back every time because of that. They don't care, and especially as a freelancer, that's a whole different ballgame of like, how do you manage what you end up doing as work? And so I end up doing a lot less work because I have to be careful what I put out there, right? And that goes to also, especially in the BBC, there is this phenomenon of the Oreo. We're brown on the outside, white on the inside, where, you know, they look the part, yet they will say whatever their producer tells them to do. They're not coming with a critical eye on the story. They're just doing exactly what they're being told to do because they see it as a job, which, you know, whatever, yeah, if this is how you want to do things. But if you're taking it seriously, that's damaging. Because then they say, Safa, why won't you do this? Because this X person is doing this. They said this, so it must be true. And I'm like, okay, so now I have to fight on every level, right? And also against other people that have the same appearance as me, yet, or not as critical. And then they're like, but there must be something wrong. The story was not reported by X. I'm like, I you know what I mean? And that becomes even more frustrating. So one of the things I think editors, commissioning editors specifically should be aware of is the emotional labor that we have to do constantly. Like when I read Ash's article, sorry Ash, I'm not picking on you, it's just I'm taking you as an example. On the end, when he thanked his editors for giving him the chance, and that made me sad. Like we're still at the point where we feel lucky for being invited to the table. I was like, gee, thanks for giving me the opportunity, right? White people don't feel that way. Yeah, it is taken for granted that this is something that that they're giving the opportunity. Of course, I should go to country X and write about it when I know jack shit about it and I don't speak the language and I don't have any historical context or anything, and I have no problem talking to a local journalist, stealing all their stories and ideas and then regurgitating them, and all of a sudden you're the one with the credibility, right? And so, and this is like the example of the Pulitzer story, that one that talked about Guantanamo Bay prisoner. And it was like, the prisoner wrote an entire book that wasn't acknowledged, yet the guy writes an article in the New Yorker, and then, and then all of a sudden it's like, and so even the power of the narrative of who gets to tell our stories, right? And we're still feeling, yeah, we still are fighting for even that being in the room in a way that enables us to do these things. And so I know what we're saying is like, how do we empower ourselves to do this? But it's actually quite difficult to be cognizant of every step of the way, your responsibility. And that is exhausting. Of what, or starving. I mean, really, you can go for long periods of time saying, no, I'm not going to do this. Like a production company got in touch with me a while back. It's like, what was the word? What do you dream of making as a film, right? On Saudi woman. and I'm like, so what's your rate? And how many weeks do you have? And I'm going to charge you X amount for development. And she's like, no, I don't do this. Just tell me what you dream of, and then we'll work it out. Like, she wouldn't even, and this is a woman, she wouldn't even acknowledge my time. She thinks that, she's like, oh, I will give you, you can screen your films, and then you'll have Q&As. I'm like, honey, did you Google me before you talk to me? Like, why do you think this is a special thing for me? Like, I'm a professional, you're a professional, respect my time, right? And this is my rate, right? Another one was like, what is your rate? I don't know what. And I'm like, this is my rate for the week. And he's like, for an investigative story, like the dangerous investigative story. And it's like, so what do I get for that week? And like, what do you mean, what do you get for that week? You get my time. you get my journalism.
I think that's a sort of also an age-old problem with freelancers in general as well, Safa. Yeah. And I really feel your frustration and your anger and your huge sense of responsibility that you obviously feel for telling those kinds of stories. And I know this is, something that is a huge responsibility and frustration for you. And I feel your pain on that, definitely. So Pierre, are you with us?
Yes, I'm here. Hi.
Hello. How are you?
Hey, I'm cool. Just hanging out here on the side of a mountain.
Excellent.
But I have to sit in the car because there's no electricity.
You're in the car. Brilliant. You're in Switzerland?
Yeah. And
Fabulous.
German part of Switzerland.
Great. So Pierre, obviously you're a photojournalist of quite a number of years experience, and you've worked in a lot of different regions, and you're originally obviously French Nigerian. Tell us a little bit about your experience when you first came to the UK, which I think was about 20 years ago.
I arrived in Britain in '96, and coming from Berlin, where I had kind of been working quite steadily over there from the time the Berlin Wall fell up to '96, and then came to Britain with a decent portfolio. But subsequently, even all the different agencies and places I went to, basically it was like, yeah, well, we'll call you back. I mean, this is actually great stuff, but we'll call you back. And I never heard from them. So in a certain sense, I mean, I had then to start working in another, trying to make money through other ways. And then
yeah, would you just mind, just sorry to interrupt you there, can you just look more into the camera? That's brilliant, just so we can see.
Sorry.
Fabulous. Excellent.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah, so I had to work and make money by other ways, other means. And then by around 2011, I came back again to photojournalism, and I have been kind of working steadily in that since that time. And I must say, it still is extremely difficult to kind of not even to get commissions, but even just to publish, basically. That's not only because of the diversity issue, but I think it's also because of the general state of photojournalism since 93, 94, when we got kicked out of the magazines in place and put in place was celebrity stories. that was particularly after the Bosnian Civil War, and people, they said, oh yeah, well, you know, we're all saturated with it. But I mean, to talk about diversity, I think that there is something which actually has to kind of come from a kind of education. I remember my education, like history, particularly in Kenya, where I kind of spent quite a few years growing up. We studied history for GCSEs, the equivalent, or the O-levels was called over there, and we studied not only Western civilization to a certain extent, but also a lot of kind of African civilization prior to colonialism, during colonialism, and post-colonialism. And that kind of creates a very different kind of worldview with regards to understanding other people and also being able to kind of work. So where I'm coming with that is that they're basically in the broadcast, in storytelling through our business. It is important to have that kind of diversity, because I mean we cannot have any kind of just one story to be told from one perspective, which is what history is being taught in Britain at the moment to my kids, for example. Is like they have no idea about African civilizations. They're not taught about the colonial history of Britain, and that creates, you know, in Britain. I mean, I think Britain is an extremely racist society, and it's become more and more clear as the Black Lives Matter demonstrations have been out in the streets. But I mean, it's so deeply ingrained, this whole idea of white privilege, and that is the well, that's the top of the, you know, that's the top of the mountain, and everybody else is below that. And I think to be able to change that, I mean, even inside our fields, I mean, you've talked about quotas, you've talked about mentoring, you've talked all about these things, but it's going to be, you know, it's like a drop in an ocean, these kind of things. And it has to come from education. I mean, it has to come from the next generation, this generation and the next generations coming, being educated at the diversity of the world that exists around them in the schools and also in the universities. I mean, we were having a discussion last night down in the valley with some friends who actually, we went to school together in Kenya, and we've just kind of found ourselves over here. And they were talking a lot about the difficulty in their children being able to know where all this is coming from. And it's I think, you know, we have to. And then there's another thing here which I kind of find really interesting, which is the internalizing the white gaze. And in all the kind of work that I did in the Balkans and all that area during the 80s and 90s, there was always a very interesting kind of not reflection, but kind of way people kind of looked at me walking around in certain situations, or in all kind of different situations with the cameras, and then being kind of either not, sometimes being aggressive, some other times kind of being questions like, you know, what the hell are you doing here? Or who the hell do you think you are doing here? And then there's also the other side of things, which is a little bit the thing where you then, well, myself as a photographer, kind of going into certain situations, I'm thinking, well, oh, okay, well, maybe this is actually going to get published because it kind of suits within the picture editors who kind of like to see photos from this particular direction. I mean, you know, some of the people on your panel are a lot more articulate than me about these things, but the experience I've had now since like 86 has been very you know, very disappointing. And even now, when I kind of change from one agency to another agency, you know, there is no contact. I mean, these guys were sitting there. You know, I get stories over to them. I send them photos and all these kind of things, and maybe once in a blue moon, they will kind of establish some sort of contact with me. And I kind of find that really kind of quite disappointing, actually, because I mean, yes, there are a few of us out in the streets of London or in certain places photographing of color. The stories that kind of come out of that are not touched upon. I mean, nobody's publishing. I mean, except of course with the Black Lives Matter demonstrations and all that movement that has happened now is kind of brought in a slight awareness about it. But I mean, you know, whether things are going to budge or not, I don't think so. And I definitely don't think it's going to happen in the next, like, you know, 20 years. But the thing is, for that to actually happen is to change the systemic and the structural racism that exists in a lot of these countries, not only in Britain, but also in France, in Spain, in Italy, and be able to kind of change that, but like fundamentally, I mean, really fundamentally.
And so you've got quite a pessimistic view then, but it seems to me that there's an enormous amount of a lack of awareness, or should we say even ignorance about, like you say, about colonial history in Britain, that's helping to fuel that prejudice. So is education for you would be a key factor in helping to change that?
Education is primordial. I think education is the only way that things are going to be able to change. I mean, we can try and we can bring the awareness, which what Black Lives Matter demonstrations have been doing, is bringing awareness. But then to be able to actually change things, to actually, like some of your panelists have said, that you know, having a commissioning editor who is in a position of power, in a position of in a space where they can actually call out to people and bring people in who will have not only the skills but also the vision to kind of tell these stories. There has to be more people like that. I mean, but then for people to kind of get to that space, there was also something very interesting which was said about the person who went to Columbia University, and then said that, but then Yasha, yes, and she said, well, there are some people who had the opportunity of getting a scholarship and going to the university, and then being obviously at a different level because of the degree that the person has. But then there's so many African photographers, there's so many photographers, black photographers who are living here in Europe, who don't have that opportunity to kind of be able to add all those extra, first of all, the skill set that they learn in the universities, but then also to be able to, so that kind of puts them at a particular place, which then perhaps makes commissioning easier or kind of enhances the reputation or things like that. But then, there are, you know, there's a whole swathe of other photographers who are not, you know, not even close to that. And I think that, you know, I mean, there's, I guess for me in my mind at the moment, which is kind of like a success idea, and that's actually more in the direction of fashion, and is the new chief editor of Vogue Britain, and I think that is a very positive change. There is now a few photographers who are doing fashion for Vogue, who are African or who are Black British, and I think it's fantastic. But for that to have happened, I mean, it's amazing, and I think, but we need to do this within our industry as well. I mean, in broadcasting and in photojournalism and in journalism as well.
Yeah, I mean, obviously there's still, it sounds like there's still obviously a lot of work to be done yet, particularly with education. So I'm just going to throw it back open now to everyone. Has anyone else got anything else they'd particularly like to add after hearing everyone speak? Does anyone would like to say any more? Has anyone got any more points they'd like to add?
Yeah. Can I just follow up?
Sure,
on
Safa.
their stuff? What he was saying, I think with commissioning editors, I'm not saying that they're necessarily racist, but if you're white and you don't have access to diverse pool of people, because they're not the people that you will naturally have a drink with or meet, and like the nature of how things get commissioned. And so that feeds into the racist structure that we live in, right? And so unless you fit into the stereotype that they find acceptable, credible, building that trust and that relationship takes a long time. And long form journalism in any ways is a very difficult thing, for at least in my experience, right? And it's like to build that relationship. But if you're not part of that group, there's no way of you being introduced to that circle of commissioners. It is extremely hard to get in, right? And so I've spoken about this before, but like, if you do dangerous assignments, you need to build a relationship of trust with your commissioning editor, and vice versa, right? Only fair, right? But how do you get to that point? Talks about access and privilege. I had the privilege of having that access. Thus, I built a trust that, okay, this person can deliver what she claims is the story, which goes back to what Nyasha was saying. It was like, the story is not happening, right? Because they don't know her, right? But how do you know her? Right? How do you build that relationship to the extent where you are pitching difficult long form investigations to come to the point where they will take the risk on you that they would consider less of a risk from a white person, because they know they get what they're trying to get out of us, because we're all cogs in the machine, right? And so, but brown people are difficult clogs because we don't fit the way they want us to fit, right? We're constantly clogging up the system. And so they would much prefer to have people who are just part of the system, who fit smoothly, produce whatever, no pushback on the narrative, no pushback on the process, the workflow, none of these things, right? It's a headache for a commissioning editor. He has 10 million other things to worry about. Why would he commission me? Because I'm difficult. I'm known as difficult, right? For all of these reasons that we've talked about. So why bother hiring me when they can hire another brown person that is less difficult, that will do exactly what they want, and then you get less work, right? And so all of this works against you and I. So the systemic issue needs to be called out a lot more in these circumstances. I'm sure, Pierre, we were talking about this, right? Like it's just mind-blowing that we're still having to say this, right? And so we are constantly doing the emotional labor for them. And then they call me and they're like, oh, who do you know that can do it next time? It's like, why am I doing the work for you? You're the commissioning editor. Yeah. You should be going out there, making sure that you're meeting the right diverse kind of group of people. And if they don't fit exactly, that's not their fault, that's yours actually, right? And so, but they don't think that way. They just want clogs, because I mean, it's, media is a machine as well that needs to keep churning shit, right? And so it really, at the end, it really doesn't make that much difference for them. There's one or two that get the awards, that those are the blips, and then you get lucky, and I'm aware I'm one of those that is lucky, right? But then even with me, and we're not talking about entry-level interns or anything, right? Even with me, that I should have a better track record than a lot of other people to do this, yet every time it's a battle. Every time it's a battle. It does not get easier. Actually, it gets harder, because I come naively thinking that this is going to be easier this time. It's not.
And that's actually a really good point you mentioned about how commissioning editors and execs should be actively sourcing BaME talent, because if you don't know, I know this is something that I've spoken to with commissioning editors before, where they've actually said, I don't know any people of color who are directors, for example, which is utterly shocking. And it's like, well, if you don't know, then you should be making it your business to know. Well, there's two things to that. One is, if you really genuinely don't know, then you should be making it your business to find and source and actively find and encourage BaME directors, producers, filmmakers, presenters, adventurers.
That's a racist thing to say, right? Because one, it's a lie, but two, what they're actually saying is these people of color are not up to the standard that we require, right? And that's a different standard than if they were looking for a white person to do it, right? I can give you endless examples of me being people getting in touch with me to do a massive series on Saturday, massive, like amazing budget, right? And they talk to me for hours about it. And then it actually gets commissioned. I don't get hired. They hire a bunch of white people that don't speak Arabic and never been to Saudi Arabia. Then they get in touch with me while I'm in Yemen. And it's like, do you mind shooting a few things for us? I'm like, so you don't want to hire me as a director that has a say in your content, but you want me as a camera person? You can go but this is it, right? And so
that's a very, very common example.
Right, but this is their life, that there's nobody that can do this. They know me personally. It's not like they don't know who I am, right? But they have the audacity to want to hire me as a camera person. So when an exec says this to me, I know they're racist.
But that was the other thing I was going to say, is the people who say that they don't know any diverse filmmakers. Generally speaking, that's not true, because I know a lot of diverse filmmakers who do email them and never hear back. So, there is a slight fudging there about, are you sure you don't know any diverse filmmakers? Okay, guys, we're sort of
talking about the about the emotional work that you need to do, the additional emotional work. And just a small example on that is a sort of subject matter that you're expected to be able to talk about as a person of color. So if I were to say, look, I'd really like to do something about Colombia, they'd be like, what connection do you have to Colombia? Why don't you go and do something about India? Don't get me wrong, I think it's a lot of really valuable stories to tell about India, largely because a lot of the stories about India have been told through a really ignorant pro-Raj perspective, pro-occupation perspective, let's call it what it was. And what you don't get is if a white director or a white presenter wants to go and do something about India, they don't ever have to justify that. Or a white person wants to go and do something about Kenya. So, oh yes, my great grandfather had a ranch there in Kenya. That's, so, of that kind of whole emotional labor, there's also like a sort of what you're allowed to do as a person of color. And then there's this sort of credibility, like if you are, I presume it's just because we're used to seeing bumbling buffoons from certain backgrounds ending up as prime ministers. Their competency is obviously not particularly good, but people presume that for people of color, particularly women of color, they just don't have the competency because they're not used to seeing them thrust into positions of authority and power based on what school they went to. So I think, that emotional labor is both on the things you're allowed to talk about and the way that you're perceived as by those execs and those that are giving you work. So yeah, it is, that is why it's important to have people in positions of decision making who can see past that, who are able to say, these are stories that are worth telling, and these people are just as justified to tell those stories. In fact, they are probably better because they'll give you a new insight. Just a really good example. If you had if Nyasha was to go and do a piece about Brazil, that would give an entirely new perspective to what's his name, the guy that does all the ones for the BBC about Brazil. Now, he does really good stuff, Simon Reeve. But having a black woman do that perspective in Brazil is very different to a white man. And I think that would be amazing. Why are they not commissioners going? Why are they not sat there going, that would be amazing? They'll go, yeah, but why should a woman from Zimbabwe tell it? It's like, well, why should a guy from Surrey tell it? That question never sits in their minds, which is, I find it really odd.
And I think that's a really excellent point to end on, and I completely get you. Sorry, Pierre.
No. Okay, go ahead. I was just going to come back on the internalizing of the white gaze, which I find that's actually an amazing concept and something that we all have to kind of directly or indirectly kind of fight against, or kind of decolonize our gaze, so to speak. Because I do find myself at in certain situations, like, thinking, what's going to sell, and in that thinking of what's going to sell, then I'm also kind of finding myself then in that mode of thinking, this is going to sell, that's going to sell, that's going to sell, but that's not my authentic voice, really, is it? I mean, it's something else which is kind of coming through. Anyway, but on that note, yeah.
Thanks very much, Pierre. Yeah, I totally get where you're coming from there. So do we have time for Q&A? If there are any Q&As coming through, Sarah? I think Sarah's muted herself. Can you hear me, Sarah? Okay,
Hi,
guys.
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't think we have time because we've overrun. But we will continue this discussion in further webinars and posting this video on our YouTube channel. Please do comment and share. It's a very important conversation, and I really just want to thank all the panelists for your honestly excellent and thought-provoking contributions. We have a lot to go on after this conversation, I think.
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone. That was a really, really provoking, thought-provoking discussion. And yes, everything will be available on YouTube, on the Frontline Freelance Register YouTube channel, and also on Facebook on the Frontline Freelance Register page. So thanks again, everyone. And let's hope that things will change slowly but surely, or if not, overnight. Thanks again, everyone.
Cheers, guys. Lovely.
Cheers. Thanks a lot.
Take it easy.
Lovely to meet you. Have a good day.
Me too.
You too, guys.
Cool.